In this video, I tried and ranked every weapon in Season 5 of the finals. This video is out a little later in the season than I would have liked, but I wanted to make sure that I spent enough time with all of the weapons and did enough research to properly represent them. As always, I'll have everything timestamped down below if you just want to look for a specific weapon, and with that, let's begin. Let's start things off with some of the heavies' melee weapons. Now, the sledge has been a staple weapon for a lot of heavies for a while now, and a good sledge player can be really scary. It being able to break the arena is also really nice too. But I do, however, think that it has some notable counters such as stun gun, and a coordinated team who knows how to counter Sledgehammer can make it sometimes really hard to find value with. I'd place it in the B tier. After that is Spear, and Spear is a weapon that I think is pretty decent, but it's in a bit of a weird place at the moment. You can do some pretty fun stuff with the animations on it, and the recent buffs this season have made it even better, but in a lot of situations I'd honestly just prefer the sledge. However, I wouldn't say this weapon is bad, just a little more niche than the Sledgehammer, so I'll put it at a high C tier. After that is the KS-23, and I've been saying for a while now that the KS-23 has the potential to be a very powerful weapon, but a lot of players just aren't good with it. If you can hit your shots, the weapon has pretty good range, and I recommend using it with the winch claw. You can also prep walls for destruction by firing 2 rounds into them, reloading, and then firing a single shot when you are ready to breach. I think that this weapon is probably either a low A tier or a high B tier, but for the purposes of this list, I'm going to put it at the bottom of A tier. Now, the SA-12 is pretty much the best weapon you can use on heavy in a decent amount of the maps. It's good with mesh, charge, and winch, and the potential DPS is absolutely ridiculous. Along with being able to animation cancel with a melee or a winch, or juggle mesh in between shots, this weapon enables a lot of the most powerful playstyles on heavy. I can't place this weapon anywhere other than S tier this season. Now, the Lewis has remained one of the most consistent options on heavy for a while. It does pretty good damage and has decent range, with the main drawback being the sometimes aggressive recoil. I think this is heavy's most versatile gun, and I'd place it in the A tier. Now, the M60 is kind of comparable to the Lewis, except that it has worse range, slightly worse damage, but an insane amount of ammo in the mag. For the most part, I don't really find myself taking advantage of the ammo all that much, and would prefer the little bit of extra damage and range that the Lewis gun gives, but for some players the M60 might be a better choice. It's a decent choice for heavy, and I'd place it in the B tier. The 50 Akimbos are a seriously underrated weapon. If you hit headshots, the gun has an absolutely insane time to kill and really good effective damage. If you are an aim labs or a Kovacs enjoyer, I definitely recommend using these weapons, as they are pretty effective at every range if you can consistently hit your shots. That being said, if you are hitting body shots or missing with these, it might be a better idea to use something like the Lewis or the M60. I'd place these up in A tier. Now, the MGL is another weapon that I would consider to be niche. It can be a pretty good weapon in the right hands, but it shares a lot of similarities with the CL40, which I'll talk about later, in that it is easily countered by a lot of things. It's definitely a pretty silly weapon, but I have to keep it in the C tier for now because most weapons are just easier to use and better. Now, the Flamethrower is considered by many to be a niche weapon, but it can be very effective if used correctly, and I actually think it's better than the MGL. By juggling mesh in between bursts of flame and even adding some pyromines mid-engagement, you can turn this into a really good weapon for more drawn-out engagements. It definitely has its limits though, such as its range, and it's sometimes failing to succeed in scenarios where you need a ton of burst damage. But overall, I'd place this weapon in the B tier. And finally, for heavy, the Shack is one of the most recent additions to the game, and it effectively functions as an SMG for heavies. And yes, I know it's technically a rifle, but it plays and has the damage range of an SMG. The DPS on this gun is really good, but it does end up being inconsistent at longer ranges. From what I've seen and experienced regarding this gun, it's definitely something I would consider adding to your heavy's arsenal, and I would place it in the A tier. Also, if you want to see more videos on the finals, a subscription is really appreciated. We're getting really close to 10,000 subscribers now, which is absolutely crazy. So if you want to be here before that happens, make sure that you subscribe down below. Now that we're getting into medium, let's just get the 3 assault rifles out of the way: the FCAR, the FAMAS, and the AKM, and let's start with the FCAR. Now, it might not be as dominant as it was in Season 1, but it's still a very good weapon. If you can hit your shots, the gun will do very well for you, and it also has the fastest time to kill out of the medium ARs against light players. It feels even better this season with the visual recoil changes, and I would definitely recommend that you give it a try. At the end of the day, it's up to you and your specific playstyle on whether you would use the FCAR, FAMAS, or AKM, but they're all pretty good, and I would definitely put the FCAR in the A tier this season. Now, the FAMAS has been doing pretty well for a little while now, and that hasn't changed in Season 5. The time to kill against medium and heavy players is better than the FCAR, but it does have a slightly worse TTK against lights. If you can learn how to use this weapon, it can do insane work for your team, and it's going in the A tier right above the FCAR. Now, the AKM is kind of a middle ground between the FAMAS and the FCAR. While it doesn't quite have the same damage per second that the other classes have, it still puts out a respectable amount and the weapon feels very consistent. It also has a very good amount of damage per mag, and I recommend it if you play Heal Beam, are fighting Mesh Shield Heavies, or just don't have very great aim. I'm going to place it in the A tier right behind the FCAR, but honestly, all of these ARs feel pretty comparable to each other in my opinion, and I think you can do well with all of these. Now, the pike absolutely dominated for a majority of last season, but after it got nerfed, people didn't really want to use it anymore. The time to kill was pretty heavily hit, making it so that most people would rather just use an AR or a shotgun. It does end up having the best medium time to kill at longer ranges because it keeps so much of its damage, but besides this, it's pretty suboptimal. I'd place it at low B tier at the moment. Now, CL40 was a weapon that also absolutely dominated for a little while last season, but now it's nowhere near as insane as it once was. While you can still be effective with it, the long reload time makes it feel clunky at times, and it has a large amount of counters, such as placing an APS in a 1v1, running up to the CL40 user so they end up dying to self-damage, or simply having high ground, or just bouncing on a jump pad constantly. And until these things aren't an issue anymore, I'm going to consider this weapon a niche pick, which lands it in the C tier. Next up, the revolver is definitely feeling a lot better this season, as the hipfire change actually made it pretty fun to use. However, you really have to hit your shots to be effective with it, and it does struggle at some of the longer ranges. I'd place it at the high end of B tier because while I might not think it's the best gun for medium, it definitely has a time and place and can do very well in the hands of a skilled player, but it really is punishing if you miss any of your shots. Now, next up, the Model 1887. It has pretty much been the undisputed king of medium weapons for more than a full season now. The change to the spread really didn't affect this gun, and this thing still has insane damage and allows you to either play around cover or take full advantage of movement in between shots. The only drawback to this gun is the very slow reload time, but everything else more than makes up for it, landing it easily in the S tier. The dual blades are a weapon that I really like the concept of, but in high level lobbies they really end up being a bit of a liability rather than an asset. The changes made to them this season definitely helped them, but not enough in my opinion. Medium itself just isn't really a great melee class, as it doesn't have things like winch or dash that light and heavy use with melee builds, and I think until something like this is given to medium, melee weapons will remain an inherently niche option. I'm going to place the blades in the D tier. I definitely want these things to be better, but in practicality, these just don't do well against coordinated teams that know how to counter them. Next up, I think the Riot Shield is a little bit better than the dual blades, but it's still a niche pick. Being able to block damage while you are running makes them better than the dual blades in my experience, but once again, medium isn't a great melee class, and coordinated teams can hard counter a Riot Shield user. You can do well with it, but I think you'd have more success with almost every other weapon, especially at higher levels of play. It's going into the C tier. Now finally, the Cerberus. It just launched this season, and it's been okay at best. While it does have good potential DPS, and the burn effect can clear gas and also goo, albeit a bit inconsistently sometimes, it just kind of struggles in terms of range and is completely outclassed by the model at the moment. I think this gun goes in the B tier because it's definitely still viable, but there are stronger options at the moment. And finally, we have light, and to start light off, we are going to be looking at throwing knives. They've always been a decent option for those players who want a high skill ceiling weapon that truly feels different. It has two major downsides. The first being that the effective range is pretty bad, as the knives will just drop off eventually, and secondly that if you miss even one of the knives, it really does hurt your effective DPS by quite a bit. If you aren't 100% optimal with your knives, almost every other light weapon is better. Now I know that's hard to believe because you can just keep spamming knives, but really, the time to kill for every other gun is much better than the knives if you just miss one knife. But if you can get past these drawbacks and consistently hit your shots, this weapon can be insane. Especially with the changes to right click that allow you to hold it, landing headshots with this thing can be absolutely devastating to the enemy team, and I would definitely recommend this to players who feel very confident in their aim. I'm going to place the throwing knives in A tier. Next up is the sword, and the sword is one of those weapons that makes some people absolutely rage and others find it, well, pretty easy to counter. Now, I'm one of those players who think the sword isn't a big deal. Just play with your team, have good positioning and proper spacing, and most importantly, hit your shots. However, in a chaotic environment, a sword player can really thrive, and in situations where a sword player puts you on the defensive and plays with their team well, it's definitely a threat that you have to take seriously. In my personal experience, I'd place the sword in the B tier. However, I want to mention that I think the sword is actually stronger against controller players, as they can't 180 to look at a dashing sword light as easily as those of us on M and K can. If you're a controller player, I would say that the sword can definitely be considered A tier against your inputs specifically, but that's just my opinion. After that is the Dagger, and it's one of those weapons that you can get some pretty fun clips with and can be really fun if you learn all the tech for it, but once you get up against a team that knows what they're doing, the Dagger suddenly becomes almost a liability. It's one of those weapons that is truly a niche playstyle. It's kind of feast or famine depending on the lobby that you're in. I really love this weapon, but I can't place it anywhere other than C tier in the current state of the game. Next up is the SR-84 or the sniper rifle. Besides terrorizing power shift, this sniper really hasn't had a place in the meta at all. In casual, most of the players that use this gun can't use it effectively and end up just being an annoyance to both the enemy team and, let's be honest, to your team as well. And in competitive, there's just way too much insane builds that make this gun pretty much irrelevant. And while a dedicated sniper player can make it work and even make it look really good, I'd argue that they'd have even more impact if they just switched to a different gun, like the LH1 for instance. I have to put it in the D tier at the moment. Next up is the M11, and this gun has been absolutely insane in the past 2 seasons. The time to kill is really good, and if you play a bit of an ambush playstyle, you can absolutely delete enemy teams with it. I've been bringing this into ranked for a while now, and it does just as good against Ruby players as it does against Plats. And while it doesn't quite have the range of something like the LH1 or even the V9S, it makes up for it in raw team wipe potential. I'd place it in the S tier. Now, the XP54. Here's a gun that I was a little bit of a doubter towards in the start of the season. I wanted this gun to be good, but it just felt off to me. And I figured that it was just a me thing because, on paper, the stats were actually pretty good. And as I kept playing with the weapon, I got more and more used to it now and realized that it actually is really good this season and it was just a me thing. I'd even place it in the A tier now. And while I don't think it's the best weapon for light this season, I wouldn't fault you at all for running it. The double barrel is one of those guns that is super risky but can get some crazy burst damage if played right. There's so many dominant close range weapons this season that it's really risky to play this weapon, but if you can master it, this thing can absolutely delete people. I'd place it in low A tier because coordinated teams who play distance effectively can counter it, but it can still provide really good value in general. Now next up is the M26 Matter, and some of you might be surprised about the placement of the M26 Matter on this tier list. I think it's better than the double barrel for a few reasons. One is the mag size, and second is the consistency of this gun. Not to mention, a very big tournament was won with one of the players using this very gun. I've been playing with it a lot this season, and honestly, it's kind of insane and feels more versatile than the double barrel in a lot of situations. Now, that doesn't mean that the double barrel is necessarily worse in every situation, because I think there are some things that the double barrel does better, but in terms of just overall consistency, I get a lot more value out of the M26 in general, and I'd have to place it at the top of A tier, but if you wanted to place it in the S tier, I wouldn't argue with you. The 9-3R got a major buff this season, so much so that the devs called it a nuclear buff, but where specifically does it stand at the moment in this tier list? And from my initial impressions and seeing how it does in higher level lobbies, I'd place it as a high B tier weapon, but I could always be proven wrong in the future by someone proving this weapon is actually insane. But as it stands right now, it seems like a decent weapon and it's definitely a lot better than it was before, but I'm not sure that it's quite as good as something like the V9S, M11, or the XP54, which are really its main competitors at the moment, but I definitely don't consider this weapon to be a throw pick anymore. I think it's actually pretty decent in its current state. Now, I've always considered the V9S to be one of the best weapons that you can pick for light. The time to kill is pretty generous, the reload and damage potential is insane, and it's super versatile and allows you to be much more useful at range than the M11. And while it might be a little bit harder to use, and it can be outclassed at the farther ranges by the LH1, if you get good enough with this gun, it can absolutely shred through teams and allows you to play a bit more of a versatile playstyle. And in the finals, I feel like versatility is really, really important. I'd place it at the top of A tier. Next up, the bow is one of those weapons that can be really insane when used correctly, but it has little to no room for error. It really embodies the hit and run playstyle that makes light really powerful, but it lacks the DPS that some of the other guns have, and it can struggle a bit when taking on a team with heal beam or a mesh heavy guarding a cash out steal. It's a solid weapon that goes in the B tier. And finally, the LH1. And last time I didn't put the LH1 very high because Pyke was still dominating the meta at the time, and it made being an LH1 user pretty hard. But that's now changed, and the reduction in visual recoil and the addition of the red dot sight, which is something I've wanted on the gun for a while now, have really changed the placement of this gun for me. And while guns like the Shack 50, SA12 and model are all at the top of the meta, it's really powerful to be able to deal damage from a safe range as a light. Not to mention that it pairs really well with the grapple gateway playstyle, which is really strong and ranked specifically right now. I have to place it in the S tier. And that right there is my opinion on where all the weapons stand on a tier list in the finals. You guys let me know, do you agree with this tier list? Do you disagree with this tier list? Would you put any of these weapons a little bit higher or a little bit lower? Let me know down in the comments. A big thank you to my channel members shown on screen here. I really appreciate you. Make sure that you join the Discord, link in the description, and I will see you in the next video.